So I'd like to welcome the international students and alumni to this, which is the third event in a five-part webinar series this fall semester created specifically for you, the international students and alumni. We have an incredibly timely topic today and a terrific speaker. But before we introduce him, we'd like to get to know you guys better. We have a short poll that we're going to put on that we'd like you to respond to so that we can learn a little bit more about you. And I would encourage those of you who are on to at least put your video on so we can see who you are. We're going to be inviting you to ask questions. So if you have your video on, we'll be able to see you when you do that. And the poll is up now, so please go ahead and answer it. So the poll shows us that we've got quite a few alumni, 3/4 alumni, really spread across all the schools, with predominance from Georgetown College. Actually, predominance from the School of Foreign Service. And we've got quite a few alumni. As to nationalities, this poll is a little bit like the current election early voting. We still need a lot more votes to come in. They're coming in slowly, but we have people from all over the world, quite a few dual citizens, more votes coming in, but quite a few dual citizens as I am. From everywhere from Colombia, London, Greece, Hong Kong, Japan, 2 from Japan. So we're glad Germany. So it's great to see that we've got a wide variety of people joining us, and I'm sure more will be joining us. Let me introduce E.J. Dionne, our speaker. E.J. is a Georgetown University professor in the Foundations of Democracy and Culture. He's also a syndicated columnist for the Washington Post and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's a regular political commentator on television and radio, and he's part of our international community because he got his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford in sociology in 1982. He's the author of 8 books, 2 of which are New York Times bestsellers, one of which is a National Book Award nominee. And his current book is called Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. EJ, why don't we turn over to you?
Well, first, I want to thank everyone for being here this morning and thank Georgetown for putting on this event. I always say my love of Georgetown goes very deep because my wife went to Georgetown, and now nearly 30 years ago, we got married at the Dahlgren Chapel, a beautiful place many of you remember. And so I feel very fortunate that we got to be married there. And I've now been teaching at Georgetown for, I think it's officially 18 years or 17 years, I believe. And I have just loved my engagement with the place. And so I'm grateful that you all, I see there are a lot of alumni on the call. Thanks for your continuing engagement with Georgetown. I want to put what we're facing here in context. And for those of you who might have seen my column in the Washington Post, you know that I have actually very strong views about how I think the election needs to turn out. But I'm not really going to talk in those terms in this conversation unless somebody cares to ask me, because I'd like to be a bit more analytical for this audience and for our purposes here today. I think that the election of Donald Trump in 2016 was at one and the same time a shock and a continuation of a lot of trends that had been set in motion long before his election. I think you can see his election in more immediate terms as a response to the Great Recession combined with rising inequality. And here, in the reasons I'm going to give for Trump's election, I'm really talking about things that have happened across the democracies in Europe and elsewhere around the world. That in many countries in Western Europe, in Poland, in Turkey, in Hungary, in India and Brazil to some degree, there are bits and pieces of these same developments happening that have challenged democracy and challenged traditional ruling groups in all these countries. So the Great Recession was combined with globalization and rapid economic change to produce an awful lot of discontent. And just to make that comparison, if you look at some of the places that switched toward Donald Trump from Barack Obama between 2012 and 2016, they were often old industrial areas like Erie, Pennsylvania, or Reading, Pennsylvania, parts of Michigan and Ohio, Toledo, and a place all across the Midwest, and also even in states that Hillary Clinton carried, like northern parts of northern New York or southern Illinois. These were all places that had been shaken economically. And they were the same kinds of places that shifted toward Boris Johnson and Brexit in Britain, toward Marine Le Pen in France in the election against Emmanuel Macron, and in a lot of other places. So this discontent cannot be underestimated, and it was an attention must be paid to us kind of vote. Secondly, and related to that, our nation and the world and the West has gone through a great deal of cultural change. There was some backlash against that, particularly among older voters. This was linked to opposition to immigration, which again you see in Britain, in France, in Germany, with the rise of the AfD in Germany. And all of these came together. And there was also some straight up racism going on in that election. We can have a conversation about how the relative role of race in economics in the 2016 election. I think they were sort of linked in a sense. I think Trump succeeded in linking, if you will, as some scholars I know in a book called Identity Politics wrote, Trump almost racialized economic discontent in 2016. Now, with all of that, Donald Trump still lost the popular vote in 2016 by 2.9 million. And he won the election narrowly. And so I think you had to take into account two specific factors related to 2016. One was an intense dislike among a significant number of voters for Hillary Clinton. Now, I personally did not share that feeling. I could talk about Hillary Clinton. I think she, in a funny way, she was a more attractive candidate than her campaign almost allowed her to be. Nonetheless, there was a lot of dissatisfaction with Clinton, and that was linked in some cases all the way back to the original Clinton years. This, I think, was more decisive than anything else in bringing Donald Trump to the White House. If you looked at the exit poll on Election Day, the very day Trump was elected, the very same electorate that elected Donald Trump, 60% of that electorate had an unfavorable and negative view of Donald Trump. The problem for Democrats is that 55% of that electorate also had a negative view of Hillary Clinton. And if you took the group of voters, what pollsters like to call the double haters, the people who dislike Trump and dislike Clinton, they accounted for 17% of all voters, and they voted 47-30 for Trump, with the rest going third party. In other words, Donald Trump did not win the election because a majority of Americans were Trumpists. He won the election because a critical group of Americans decided they disliked him less than they disliked Hillary Clinton. And finally, and again, we can talk more about this, this was all set in motion in the end by the Comey letter. I think the Comey letter switched the election, given how close the election was in the three critical states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. There's no question that the Comey letter, if you look at the polling, right before the letter was released, Clinton had a 5.9% lead. A week later, her lead had shrunk to 2.9%, and by election day, it was down to 2.1%. So the combination of just dislike for Clinton and the Comey letter gave us Trump. And precisely because a majority of Americans actually voted for a candidate other than Trump, discontent and shock over his election produced an almost instant movement against him. And some of you will remember the extraordinary demonstrations all across the world, and most relevant to our electoral system all across the United States. The day after Trump's inaugural, the demonstration in Washington was extraordinary, but it was matched by demonstrations all over the country. Thus began a new movement. Let me just parenthetically insert a possibly good thing for democracy coming out of all of this. And this comes from a friend of mine, the scholar Theda Skocpol up at Harvard, that if you look at the political mobilization of the Tea Party movement during the Obama years and the anti-Trump movement, you've had an extraordinary number of Americans pulled into political action in the last 10 to 20 years. Well, we can really 10 years since the Tea Party. Over the last decade, an extraordinary number of Americans have been activated. And you saw the pushback against Trump almost immediately. And the 2018 election was sort of a real measure of that. In the 2018 midterms, we had the highest voter turnout as a country in a midterm election as we had had in over 100 years, since 1914. The Republicans got 10 million more votes in House races in the 2018 elections. The Democrats got 25 million more votes than they had 4 years earlier in the 2014 midterms. And you're seeing that activation continue now. As of this moment, sitting here, all of us, more than half the people who voted in the last election have already cast ballots in this election, whether by mail or in drop boxes or in early in-person voting. We have 5 voters in our household, Mary and I and 3 kids, and we have all voted. I don't think we have ever all as a group voted this early. That's happening in households all over the United States. I always tell people that I resigned my membership in the Prognosticators Union at around midnight on election night 2016. Although, as I also say, you can't chase a bookie from the racetrack. So I will tell you what I think is going on. But I think all of us were endowed with a certain amount of humility. I'll just make 3 quick points to close so we can go to Q&A. I think the Democrats ended up in Joe Biden with a candidate most likely to pull together the various pieces of the anti-Trump coalition who needed to be pulled together. And I think at the end of it all, obviously this depends on Biden winning the election. If he does win the election, I think we're going to go back and say he managed the politics of this remarkably well. First, he's closing on the same theme that he opened his campaign on almost 2 years ago. That doesn't happen very often. He is closing on the theme that this election is a referendum on the soul of America. You have seen this side of the Biden campaign, especially in some really very moving ads, almost Reagan-esque ads that he has run during World Series games and sports events, which are designed to appeal to a very national, very broad audience. Secondly, he has really stitched together the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party is now probably a little over center and center left, and then the other half is quite progressive. And Biden has managed to put together a program that is a real marriage of center left and moderate ideas with the ideas of progressives. To give one example, healthcare. Bernie Sanders was for a single-payer healthcare system similar to Britain's. Biden was for expanding Obamacare. Where he's ended up is sticking with expanding Obamacare with a public option, but lowering the Medicare eligibility age to age 60, which would let 23 million more people into Medicare. That is a very popular position. There are a lot of people 60 to 65 would like to get into Medicare. About 1 million of them, by the way, live in Florida. And yet at the same time, he has stuck to his principle that he will not support a radical change. He simply wants to get everybody covered. And if I may say one thing as a book author, which is what Code Red was about, was in part was an argument that moderates and progressives had a lot more in common than they realized. And I think the Biden campaign has shown that. Biden also is someone I think who is uniquely placed to win back some share of the blue collar Trump voter, where Georgetown, we can also say some share of the white Catholic vote, which overlaps with the white, broadly speaking, blue collar, which is to say white voters without a college education, without a college degree. He is the son of Scranton, and he did grow up middle class. He's always had sympathy for unions. And he has very aggressively gone after that vote. There was a chunk of the Trump vote that was available to a Democrat in the midterms. If you look at Senate and governor's races in Pennsylvania, in Michigan and Wisconsin, Democrats won in 2018, both the governor's races and the Senate races. And 10 to 15% of the Trump voters shifted Democratic. Those are key Biden targets. At the moment, if the polling is right, Biden seems to have achieved that kind of conversion. I'll talk more about the Senate and House races in our Q&A. But I just want to say, I think this election really is a referendum on the kind of country we want to be. And since we are talking at a university, and some share of this audience are students, I think it's very important to close by saying that young people, I think, will play a decisive role in this election. The young people in our country are the most progressive generation that we have seen since the greatest generation, since the New Deal generation. The younger generation is voting by margins of 2 to 3 to 1 for Biden over Trump, many of them powered the Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders movements in the primaries. And what's really striking is the evidence so far is that they are turning out to vote in very large numbers. Our political system, one of the flaws, I believe, of our political system is that it's much tougher on young people in terms of making it easy for them to vote than it is on older people. Our registration rules make it much easier for people who are static, who live in one place for a long time. Young people, by the nature of their lives, tend to move around. And yet young people have gone out of their way to use the various forms of early voting, according to a variety of studies that have come out in the last week. I think that's very heartening for us. I think it gives us a chance as a country to be forward-looking rather than backward-looking. And I do think this election is a referendum on whether we want to heal and move forward, or whether a plurality of Americans want to continue to fight out the culture wars that have helped make President Trump our president. And I'll just close on a slightly less partisan note, which is to say that perhaps besides the mobilization of large numbers of Americans, it is good that elites in the US and in Western Europe and elsewhere around the world have been reminded that there is a lot of discontent in our nations, that there are a lot of people who have been left behind because of economic change and because of the rise of inequality. And I think that the paradox of the Trump years is that if he is defeated, he may have also paved the way for more progressive policies, because I think certainly Joe Biden in our country, and I suspect leaders elsewhere, but I'll stick with the US, I think Joe Biden is very aware of the need to pull together Americans across racial lines to recognize the very specific and deep discontents of African Americans, of Black Americans, with the persistence of racial injustice, but also to look at the costs of economic injustice across racial lines to Black Americans as well as lower income white Americans. One of my political heroes is Robert Kennedy, which will tell you where I'm coming from. Robert Kennedy was able to speak across these lines at another period of deep division in 1968. I think the next president is going to have that capacity to speak across our lines of division. And we pray as a country to heal us at least a little bit, because we need a lot of healing in the United States right now. Thank you, and thanks for joining us. And Philip, I'm all yours.
PJ, that was absolutely a terrific walk around through where we are right now. And this is now time for the Q&A. I'm going to take advantage of the fact by both virtue of being one of the more senior alumni in the group, class of 79, as well as the moderator to pose some questions, but I really want to invite the group as well to pose questions. And to do so, please push the raise hand button and I will introduce you, or just simply put a question in the chat box and we'll try and take your question. But one of the ones that strikes me, because you've just discussed this as being a period of divisiveness in the country, and I don't think there's any question about that, but this isn't the only period of divisiveness that we've had in this country. You mentioned Robert Kennedy, and that takes us back to 1968 with the pictures of the Chicago Convention, the Democratic Party, assassinations, Kent State taking place. We have Gore and Bush fighting the election right through to the Supreme Court. How do you compare this period of divisiveness, this election, to those other prior periods? And I guess we could even go back in history to the Civil War years to find divisiveness in the election.
You know, I'm glad you just mentioned the Civil War, and this is an unfortunate answer in a way, unfortunate at least about my view of the current time, which is, I think this resembles the 1850s that led into the Civil War more than it resembles the 60s, which is to say that I think in some ways this is worse than the 1960s war. I've been reading actually over the last decade a lot of history of the pre-Civil War and Civil War period, and I think we are divided that deeply. Obviously, I think it goes, and we've just seen this dramatically in the last year, but I think this has been continuing over a long period of time. The racial division in the country is profound, and the lines of division regionally very much match the map of the 1860 election. If you look at the Barack Obama states and look at the Lincoln states in 1860, there was a real overlap. And similarly, if you look at where the anti-Lincoln states were, there was a very strong overlap. And, you know, I think it is our divisions are not just we disagree with each other and we'll argue. It is much more, we really hate this other side. There's a great political scientist, Alan Abramowitz down at Emory, who has done a lot of research coining the idea of negative partisanship. And what makes this division particularly difficult is we are more partisan, but our partisanship hasn't changed in the sense that we feel even more strongly in favor of our own party. Our partisanship is rooted in a deep hatred of the other party. We're scared if the other side wins. We're petrified if the other side wins. And I guess the other reason I think this is worse than the 60s is that I think that Donald Trump's politics are even more divisive than Richard Nixon's politics were. If you looked at Nixon coming, and I know somebody can, I suppose that's a backhanded compliment to Richard Nixon here, that if you looked at Nixon's way of governing, Nixon was very serious about governing. He signed a lot of bills that the Democrats, who then control Congress, put on his desk. The Environmental Protection Agency was created under Nixon, and the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and a whole series. There were a series of progressive steps that Nixon approved in that period. And yes, he was very divisive. He was the architect of the Southern strategy, which began this use of race to appeal to white backlash voters. But I think with Trump, you have a figure whose whole approach to politics depends on successfully dividing the electorate in a way that leaves just enough on his side to win. Compare Trump's inaugural addresses with Nixon's, and I think you see that. And so my sense is this is more deeply divided, and you have lastly, more overlapping identities that back in Nixon's day, back in the 60s, there were conservative and liberal Democrats. There were conservative and liberal Republicans. Religious divisions were much more scrambled. Now your politics, your philosophy, where you live, your religious views, all of them are linked up, bound up in your party identification. And that leads to a much deeper form of division than we saw back then. And so we have a lot of work to do to climb out of these divisions.
You're talking about the question of religion for a moment and the moral values. I think both sides have really appealed to moral values, different moral values perhaps on each side. The Trump side seems to focus on issues associated with Roe v. Wade, reproductive rights, family values, Biden more on social and racial justice issues. How is that playing out? And how do you think, in the context of our Jesuit and faith-based traditions, do you think we at Georgetown should be thinking about this?
Thank you. You mentioned you wanted to ask that question. I was really grateful for that question. First of all, let me just point to something I wrote that's in the current issue of Commonweal, the well-known, very hallowed old Catholic magazine, where I wrote a lot about social Catholicism. And again, that the view I expressed there is a bit more polemical than I'm going to be here. But for people interested in that, they can take a look at Commonweal. I argue that the Catholic Church is underperforming in American public life, but has an enormous contribution to make because of the Church's tradition of the Catholic social thought is a real gift to the world that sometimes people outside the Catholic Church appreciate more than we inside the Catholic Church do, because it has a series of very careful balances. But I think you're really seeing in this election, in much more starkly than ever, a real confrontation between what a conservative friend of mine labeled social justice Catholics versus social renewal Catholics. Now, I disagree with his use of the word renewal, but I want to put that in the terms that, to be fair to both sides of this fight, that's how he defined the more conservative position. There is a very significant body of Catholics who believe that abortion is a primary question, who feel that LGBTQ rights, and particularly marriage equality, have been an attack on traditional values, and more generally, who see a decline in values, as they define values, as being the biggest danger to the good life, to the common good. On the other side are social justice Catholics, and I'm one of those, I should say, who argue that the biggest threat to family values are not LGBTQ people getting married. They are the economic troubles that families face. They are the racism that has put so many people in jail, so many Black Americans in jail, even for relatively minor crimes, and so on. And I think you're seeing that play out very explicitly in the Trump-Biden fight. And I think for the first time in many years, I think the social justice Catholics are fighting on more equal ground. I think since the 1990s to early 2000s, the more conservative wing, the social renewal wing, if we want to call it that, has been on the ascendancy, both because of appointments to the appointments of various bishops under John Paul and Benedict, and also the degree of organizing among more conservative Catholics. I think that the right side, if you will, of that argument has been on the ascendancy. I think you've seen that flip in this election, where more progressive Catholics are on the rise, in relatively speaking, in this battle. And obviously, the fact that Joe Biden would be only the second Catholic president of the United States is not irrelevant to that. The fact that Joe Biden kind of looks like the guy, for a lot of older Catholics, he looks like the guy who did the collection at the 11 o'clock Mass, the guy you knew in the St. Vincent de Paul, the guy you knew as a CYO coach. I mean, he's a very recognizable figure to a lot of older Catholics. And I've begun to hear an argument that a lot of us on the progressive side have been making for a while, which is, if you actually care about the right to life, you got to care about social justice, because 70% of all abortions are among lower income Americans. And that probably the best thing you could do to reduce the number of abortions is not to make abortion illegal, but to improve the choices and economic circumstances that people at the bottom end of the economy have. And I think you're seeing that argument rise. So I think we're going to have a very healthy debate among Catholics going forward. And I see that debate as on somewhat more equal footing. And some of my I'll close with this, some of my conservative friends who are against Trump, who are part of the Never Trump movement, argue that one of the reasons they've taken that position is they think that Trump himself has discredited many conservative ideas. And they believe that only pushing Trump aside will actually allow conservatives back into the argument in an effective way. I'm sure there'll be people on this call who disagree with that. I suspect there may be some conservatives out there who agree with that, and we'll see. And that includes a number of conservative Catholic intellectuals who have just found it impossible to support Trump, even though they agree with his judicial appointments and agree with what he currently says about abortion.
I must say, I think I come out perhaps as the optimist compared to your pessimist, but one thing I celebrate in this election is the fact that, unlike the Kennedy election in the early 60s, the fact that Joe Biden is a Catholic is almost a small apostrophe in the whole thing. It's not a key part. No one's claiming that the election of Biden will lead to the rule of Rome. So I think we've made some progress in this country.
Right. Although what's fascinating is, if you remember Lou Holtz, it does show how things have switched. I agree with that. Kennedy, to get elected, had to prove to Protestants that the church didn't really matter that much to him in his speech, that he would not have his views shaped by Rome. Whereas in this election, Lou Holtz got before the Republican convention and accused Biden of being a Catholic in name only. So you talk about a complete inversion of the issue of religion in American politics. It squares with your point, actually, but it looks at it from a different direction.
Now, we've got a question on the chat room, and I'll open up the to live questions from my good friend Linda Funke in London, who's really focusing on the question of the hate that appears in this election among Americans. And to what extent is that hate real, or has it been stirred up by politicians who have been elected as a result of gerrymandered districts, and also by a media which has been taking advantage of some of the controversy in our country?
That's a really good question. Thank you. And I would argue the hate is real, but it's been very much aggravated both by politicians. Gerrymandering is a piece of it. I don't think it's a decisive piece, but I think it's important. For those outside the U.S., gerrymandering was born in my native state of Massachusetts, named after Governor Eldridge Gerry. It's when you draw district boundaries. In the U.S., unlike many other democracies, the boundaries of various districts are drawn usually by politicians themselves, so they can draw up districts that favor their side and disfavor the other side, and which means that in many cases, party primaries are the decisive, not the election, and candidates playing to their more extreme wing often win party primaries. So that's part of the argument underlying her question. There's something to that, but I think that our differences are real. And yes, social media has aggravated that. Some of us are old enough to remember the time when there were basically 3 big television networks plus public television, and when newspapers were, good old-fashioned paper newspapers were a major medium of communication, where there tended to be at least agreement on the basic facts. And now this new information world, which I am a big fan of, I have more information available to me on this device than in anything in human history. It's like having 100 greatest libraries in the world in the palm of your hand, and then a lot of other data too. Nonetheless, these new forms of communication allow people to live in their own media worlds. That increases polarization. But in the end, I think some of these arguments are real and deep. I think that racial animosity and racism is real. I think that divisions among the generations are real. I think divisions over religion are real. One fact I think that's extremely important is the biggest change. I taught a class on this week. The biggest change in the religious landscape over the last 20 years is the rise of the number of Americans who are not simply switching religions, but have nothing to do with religions. They are called the religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not the N-U-N-S who taught me as a kid. And now among younger Americans, over 40% say they are not affiliated with any religion at all. So what you got is a kind of religious polarization between the nuns and on the other side, some very, very staunch conservative, as they would see it, Orthodox believers. That's just one element of this fight. So I think the divisions are real, but they're aggravated by these forces.
Now I'm going to open the floor for questions. Again, please raise your hand with pushing the little button to indicate that you'd like to ask a question. And when I call on you, please go off of mute. And when you come on, introduce yourself and let us know what class and where you're calling from. So the first person I have is Victoria Brookman. Victoria, are you still there?
Hi, Philip. Yes, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Hey, how are you? Where are you, Victoria?
Hi, thanks, Dr. Dion, for coming and speaking to us. I am currently in South London.
And that
Beautiful,
looks very British
grey
behind
South
you.
London.
Oh, cool. What neighborhood?
Brixton.
Oh, famous neighborhood.
That's right.
Yes. Great to see you.
And you. Thanks so much for putting this on and coming to speak to us. My question was in terms of some of the comments you mentioned earlier about this election being kind of a referendum on the character of our country. Apologies if this is a somewhat cynical question, but how much do you think that matters to most of America versus are they more concerned about COVID, healthcare, and their own economic prospects? And particularly what in a way kind of shocks me is the recent relatedly the Gallup poll, I think it was last week, that said that 56% of Americans think that they're better off, feel that they're better off than they were 4 years ago. What do you make of that?
So God bless you for mentioning COVID, which I should have mentioned in my introduction. I was operating several miles above the earth, I think, now that you mentioned COVID. So thank you so much for doing that. There is no question that this is, if Biden wins, it means it was the COVID election. And it's no accident that Biden is closing in two ways. He's closing on this high plane, who are we as a country? But he is talking constantly about Trump's mishandling of the virus and its cost to us. And Barack Obama was hilarious yesterday, especially if you're on the, not on President Trump's side, when he said that Trump is jealous of the virus for all the time and television time and attention the virus is getting. There's no question that COVID will be decisive. But here's what's interesting. If you go back, Real Clear Politics has a nice chart of all the polling averages. Biden's been ahead of Trump for over a year. And while the lines go up and down, the gap has been fairly consistent from the last time I looked, they had the numbers from last September 2019 to now. And it's been relatively steady. And so I think it is both. I think it is clearly COVID made a big difference, gave Biden an issue to push, to dramatize the underlying argument he wants to make, which is about the incompetence and the problems with the Trump presidency. But those arguments were there. The 56% number in terms of being better off, I am by no means the first person to say this, but I think it's true. COVID and the pandemic and the economic downturn have been a real X-ray on our social inequities. And it depends entirely on what kind of family you are in, what kind of resources do you have. I work in a job where this little device that's sitting in front of us allows me to continue my work without a loss of pay and without having to risk my life. There are so many Americans who have lost their jobs outright or who have to, in order to work and make a living, have to work under very dangerous conditions. And so if anybody, and I love the invention of this phrase essential workers, because a lot of the essential workers were the forgotten workers. We weren't paying a lot of attention to the UPS guy or to the entire staff of a hospital or to the people at the checkout counters before COVID. So I'm not shocked by those numbers. There are a lot of families who, in material terms, at least, I don't know where the stock market is today. Maybe you get a few wealthier people going negative on that question, given the last several days on the stock market. But I'm not surprised, given that that's the response, because I think it's an accurate response for the better off American families. But that's one of my reasons for hope. I don't mean to sound. I'm usually a glass 1/10 full person. I am a very hopeful person, and my favorite line about the United States is that great old Churchill line that Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities. I think we've been doing a hell of a job of exhausting all the other possibilities. I still think we're going to get there, but these problems are very deep and the divisions are real. So bless you for that question. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
We have a question from Jason Quo, who really focuses on the fact that our political system, it seems, relies very heavily on norms and mores. And Trump has probably violated more of those than most people. And the question is, are we at a point of no return? Can we return back to a system that relies on norms and mores? Or do we really have to legislate much more heavily to restrict what the president can do, keep family members out of the cabinet, divestment of personal interests, et cetera? Or can we go back to the good old days?
I really appreciate that question. One of the books that I wrote, my friends Norm Ornstein, Tom Mann, and I wrote a book called One Nation After Trump. The subtitle, which I can't claim credit for, it was Norm's, was a guide for the perplexed, the disillusioned, the desperate, and the not yet deported. And we spent a lot of time talking about the attack on norms from the president and how dangerous that is. I think the answer to your question is threefold. One is there already is pressure to legislate things that weren't legislated before, because unfortunately the breaking of these norms shows that norms are not strong enough. And so there is already legislation in Congress to require presidential candidates to disclose their tax returns and to codify a variety of expectations that we expected, but that's why they're called expectations. We expected politicians to live by them. So I think you're going to see some codification of that. I think you'll see pressure in other spheres to return to norms, as you know, that you can't legislate everything. And I think Joe Biden's campaign has in part been a campaign about restoring norms. And then I think there are some norms that might be, in order to restore the values that underlay the old norms, you might have to break certain norms. The example I would use, and I'll be happy to offline to have a conversation about it with anyone about this, is in order to balance the Supreme Court, we may have to enlarge the Supreme Court after the norm breaking involved in creating this new 6-3 conservative majority. Those who oppose enlargement of the court will say that is norm breaking. Those who favor enlargement, and I'm one of those, will say that the only way we can produce the norm of a balanced, nonpartisan court system is to take some action against the court packing that has already happened. I think that third case goes right to your point, which is to say, there are certain things that once you upset the apple cart, it's very hard to get things quickly back into balance. So some can be legislated, some can be restored, and some of the norm breaking is going to lead to some long-term arguments. And I think, I guess I'm at Georgetown, so I can be Trinitarian in my answer to that. Thank you. That's a great question.
We now recognize Hernan Correa, who is calling in from Colombia. And I'm doing that not only because of the fact that my mother is Colombian, but because he's got an interesting question. Hernan?
Oh, are you in Colombia, Mr. Correa?
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm here
Where
in
in
Bogota.
Colombia are you? One of my, I'm sorry.
In Bogota.
Oh, excellent. My Georgetown
I'm
graduating
here
nephew is
in
married to a
Bogota.
Oh, go ahead. I'll just let you go.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Hernán Correa. I am a LLM alumni from 2015. My question is the following. I want to know your opinion about the electoral college system. Do you think that this experience in the election of the first term of Donald Trump and the problems with the election between George W. Bush and Albert Gore, there is important or there is a relevant discussion right now in the US to make changes in the electoral system, electoral college system, especially because the problems regarding political representation, the difference between the votes at the output, the democratic discussion very focused in swing states with a no relevant discussion in the other kind of states. And I think for right now, this is a very unique, but also a very strange system, especially in terms of political representation. And I want to know your opinion about that.
I agree with the question. I just want to say I've had two wonderful occasions to visit Colombia in my life. One is when I covered the Vatican and I was traveling with Pope John Paul II, and I got to travel all over Colombia. And then my Georgetown graduating nephew, he's a Georgetown grad, married a wonderful Colombian woman in Cartagena. And I suggest anybody who wants to get married, Cartagena is the place to do it. What a wonderful visit that was. A friend of mine from Argentina suggested that we need the Organization of American States to supervise our electoral system and supervise this election. And I think there's something to that. I think the Electoral College is a terrible idea. It's not serving its original purpose, which was to create a deliberative body. One of the purposes of the form of representation it reflects was to protect the interests of slave states. We obviously don't want to do that now, and it actually does overrepresent white Americans relative to Black Americans or Latinos right now. And given the shifting American population toward metropolitan areas, we are going to get more results like 2000 and 2016. It's no accident that we have had this happen so frequently, and it'll happen again this year. If Trump wins, he will not win the popular vote. He will only win by eking out a majority in the Electoral College. I think we need to change it. I think it's going to be hard to change the Constitution, but there is this movement where states are pledging under the Constitution, the state legislatures pick electors, actually, and they have delegated the choice of electors to the voters. But these states have said that if states representing a majority of the Electoral College make a pact to commit all their electors to the winner of the popular vote, we could elect a president by popular vote. My own preference would be to have a national system where you would decide by the popular vote and use the instant runoff, transferable voting, so we would be guaranteed a majority president. That's where you rank first choice. Let's say hypothetically, somebody wants to vote for the Green, but would prefer Biden over Trump. They could throw a vote to the Green, number one, but then their ballot would transfer to Biden. Or if some libertarian might want to do it the other way around, libertarian Trump, but you could get a majority. I am for that. I'm not confident it'll happen anytime soon, but it's a terrible system. And imagine Trump losing the popular vote by 5 or 6 million and eking out a 2 electoral vote majority. I think that's a recipe for political crisis in our country. So I think it's a terrible system and we need to get rid of it, and it's going to be hard to get rid of. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you very much.
Given the fact that we've got a terrible system, it looks like we have an election nonetheless on Tuesday next week. And what do we look forward to? What's going to happen on Tuesday night? What are the next few days after that? How long will it take for us to have a result? And I ask that in part because my daughter tells me she's not getting out of bed until we have a final result and she can have confidence to come back into the world.
Oh, first of all, let me say there are many other things about our system, like free speech, like the free exchange of ideas. There are all kinds of things about our system I love. I just think the Electoral College is a poor representation of what a sort of a constitutional democracy is supposed to be. So I am not a hater of the whole system by any means. I think it's possible that we will have indications earlier than we think. In other words, a lot of this obviously depends on how close the election is. If there are razor thin margins in any one of the three big states and Biden does not win some other state early, then we could be in for a long count and a lot of controversy. Florida counts its votes fast and early. If Joe Biden ekes out a victory in Florida, then you can be almost certain the election is over, because if Biden has carried Florida, he's taken out a big chunk of Trump's Electoral College majority. And that also means he's probably flipped other places. I think we're going to see some indications in a lot of early counties that it will be 100% counted. As to whether other states will flip. I'm told, for example, that to the two big counties outside Detroit, Oakland and Macomb, which are big counties and tend to be counties that help determine the swing of the state, I'm told those may be fully counted fairly early in the evening. So I think this might be a bit more like a normal election in that we will get indications early, but we may not know decisively until the next morning. And that's happened often in our history. We've gone one morning. Now, if the election is very close in a few critical states, then your daughter could end up being in bed for a long time. And because it's very clear that Trump is going to go to court and try to prevent the counting of certain kinds of ballots later on. And it's also clear that more Democrats have been voting early than Republicans. So the Republicans seem to be catching up a little bit in this last week. And in that case, it could be very difficult. So obviously, like all elections, it depends on the margins. Like very few elections, if the margins are close, you will have Trump, I think, making threats that candidates don't usually make. But I also think the line in this election between a very close race and a Biden near landslide is actually quite thin. In the most of the public polls, Biden has a bigger popular vote lead at this point, a much bigger lead than Hillary Clinton had at a comparable point in 2016. So we'll see. I think we could know earlier than we think, but we should prepare ourselves not to know for several days at least.
And we have time for one more question, which I'm going to pose, which is, what has the impact been of foreign interference in this election? We've read a lot about it, and has it been happening? And where is it coming from?
I think the problem with foreign interference is when it's really well done, we don't know about it till afterward. I think that I'd be shocked if there hasn't been some. You can see, the director of National Intelligence claimed that intervention, threatening voters from the so-called Proud Boy, the fake Proud Boys, came from Iran. I think you're seeing in some of the Hunter Biden stuff some evidence of foreign interference to push that story. I think one of the keys of foreign, in particular Russian interference, is that it is designed not only to elect President Trump, certainly in 2016, and it would appear this time, but it's also to divide us from each other. I think one of the most interesting findings of all of the research into this is that I believe it was Houston, the Russian interferers set up an anti-Muslim group that was saying terribly anti-Muslim things, calling demonstrations. And then they set up an online pro-Muslim group to fight the anti-Muslim group. So these were entirely Russian-created organizations to fight each other, but they were taking advantage of our own divisions. And I think that's going to continue no matter who wins the election. And so I guess to close on an ironic point or a hopeful point, I hope that after this election, we begin to understand that, as Lincoln said, a house divided against itself cannot stand, and that perhaps we can take at least a couple of steps back from the abyss, recognize that the ways in which we have been divided from each other are really harmful to democracy. They're harmful to our standing in the world, and they give other countries real opportunities to take advantage of what we are doing to ourselves. Now, I know preaching can't do that. I think we need to heal the economy. We need to heal some basic things in the country to reduce our level of division. But I really hope there is some way after this election that we have leadership committed to bringing us together and with at least some chance, not of eliminating all our divisions, and we're a democracy, we'll always have divisions, but of at least reducing the harshness with which we deal with each other. We learned to do that at Georgetown. Georgetown teaches that sort of thing, and a person for others. We need more of that. We need more a person for others, and we need more emphasis on a common good and not just our own particular interests or the interests of our group. Bless you all, Georgetown grads. Bless you all, Georgetown students. I really appreciate your being here. And Phil, this was your idea. I really appreciate your setting this up.
And EJ, thank you so much for taking the time to spend with us and sharing your views on this topic that is of such concern to all of us. And I share one thing with you, and that is the view that it's really our Georgetown community, our international community, who can help play a real leadership role. And I'm delighted to see that our little community is not that divided. And if you look at the chat room activity here, people are spending time speaking to each other and spending time in a dialogue, and hopefully that will help in the global healing process. I'd encourage everyone to continue doing so. This webinar series, as I said, is the third in a series of 5. The next one for international students will be on Friday, November 6th at 9 a.m. with Spencer Dale and Victoria Atwood Scott. Hopefully by then we'll know the result of the election. That seminar will be on global energy transition, which has been a very key part of the electoral debate, and hopefully will be a feature of our lives going forward, discussing environmental, social, and governance considerations. So please sign up on the Global Georgetown website and encourage you to do so. I certainly will be signing up for that. And this seminar will be on the Georgetown Global website shortly and will be available for viewing, and hopefully you'll share it with others and allow everyone to participate. So again, EJ and everybody, thank you so much for participating, and we look forward to the next webinar.